Use properties of parallelograms. So our learning target today is to use the properties of a parallelogram to determine angle measures and side lengths. So first, let's define what a parallelogram is. And a parallelogram is just a quadrilateral, so a four-sided figure, with both pairs of opposite sides being parallel. So both pairs of opposite sides must be parallel. So PQ and SR are opposite sides and they are parallel, and QR and PS are opposite sides and they are parallel. Once you know that you have a parallelogram, there are a few properties that go along with that. So the first property is, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then opposite sides are congruent. So for this parallelogram, it would mean that PQ and RS are congruent, and QR and PS are congruent. Next, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then opposite angles are congruent. So Q and S are across from each other, and because this is a parallelogram, Q and S must be congruent. P and R are across from each other, and because this is a parallelogram, angle P is congruent to angle R. Alright, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then consecutive, meaning one after another, consecutive angles are supplementary, meaning they sum to 180 degrees. So here, Q and S, remember, they're opposite angles, so they are congruent. P and Q are consecutive angles, so that means the sum of P and Q must be 180 degrees. Last, if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its diagonals bisect each other. So a diagonal goes from one vertex to another, skipping one. So I go P, skip Q, go to R. There's a diagonal, and then QS is my other diagonal. And what it means is this point M is the midpoint of QS and PR. So that means that QM and SM are congruent, and PM and that should say RM are congruent. PM and RM are congruent. Alright, so let's do an example. So I want to use the properties of parallelograms to find the values of X and Y. So, if I know that this is a parallelogram because I've got opposite sides parallel, both pairs, then I know that Y and 53, angle G and angle E, must be congruent because they are opposite angles. So Y must be 53 degrees. Now, the other thing I know about parallelograms is that opposite sides are congruent. So that means that 4x minus 1 equals 15. So 4x is 16 and x is 4. Alright, find the value of x for this parallelogram WXYZ. Well, I know that these two angles must be congruent, but these two angles are supplementary, which means they sum to 180 degrees, because angle Z and angle Y are consecutive angles. So 2x is equal to 138. So x is 69. And there we go. Alright, we've been given a parallelogram ABCD with the following vertices. And so we're going to go ahead and draw these vertices on this graph. You don't have to in order to solve this problem, but I think sometimes a visual might help. So there's point A. Point B is at 5, 6. Point C is at 3, -2. And point D is at -3, -2. And I'm going to connect my vertices. It's a little straighter than doing it by hand. All right, the next thing it tells me is that all of my diagonals, they intersect at point P. So DB is a diagonal and AC is a diagonal, and that means that this point right here is point P. And I want to know what the coordinates of point P are. Now I could guess that it looks to be 1, 2 maybe, but actually in Unit 1 we talked about midpoint formula. So if you understand that the property of your parallelogram is that diagonals bisect each other, then you know that AP and CP are congruent and DP and BP are congruent. So I'm going to start by finding the midpoint between A and C. And remember that your midpoint is just the average of the 2 points. So P is going to be the average of -1 and 3. And since it's an average and I've got 2 points, that's my X value. My Y value is going to be 6 plus -2, which is the same as 6 minus 2. That's going to be my Y value. And so -3 and 2, that gives me a +1. And 4 divided by 2 gives me a +2. So my picture wasn't that bad. All right, just to double check, I want to try it with B and D, just to make sure we get the same answer. So P should also be the midpoint of these two vertices. So 5 plus -3 divided by 2, and 6 plus -2 divided by 2, which also gives us 1, 2. So P is, the coordinates of P are 1, 2. All right, take a look at these practice problems. Let me know if you have any questions. For 9 and 10, I've provided you with the graph, but if you can do it without the graph, that's fine. I think you should try graphing it and drawing the diagonals just for the practice. All right, so for number 1, X is 5, Y is 14. Number 2, A is 10, B is 5. Number 3, P is 30.75. Number 4, M is 13. Number 5, PR is 30. Number 6, the measure of angle SRQ is 50 degrees. Number 7, ST is 8. Number 8, the measure of PQR is 130 degrees. And then the last two, I hope you sketched just to get used to it, but your value for P is going to be, the coordinates would be -3/2, 1/2, and -1/2, 3.